Okay, so beginning our review today, if somebody would tell me what you would say the theme was for Isaiah chapters 1 through 5, what were they about overall?
Judgment for Israel's sin.
Okay. Anybody have anything else they're using to remember that?
And restoration.
And restoration, right? There was the promise. A clue that you
God's
can.
case against.
Yes, yeah, thanks, B. Sorry, I'm talking right over you. I'm still having weird internet issues, so just as a warning. Yeah, God's case against Israel. So remember, that's the phrase that can help you remember that one. Okay, how about Isaiah 6, the standalone chapter we had on that?
God's call, sorry.
Go ahead, Marcy.
God's call of Isaiah, and God sends Isaiah to his people.
Okay, good. How about 7 through 12?
God tells them they don't have to fear, or tells Aram he doesn't have to fear. Lots of stuff about judgment on Israel and Assyria. And then there was talk about the remnant and the government being on Jesus' shoulders.
Okay, good. So those focuses, there's a lot of different focuses in 7 through 12, but you want to start with that reminder in 7, and you can focus again on what was God's message to them. If you want to add sort of a spiritual point to those things, you know, the don't fear, right? Don't fear the nations, fear God, because as Karen ended up with, God is with us, right? There was that promise of Emmanuel was in those chapters as well. Okay, good. And then 13 to 23 was, go ahead, B, I'm sorry.
The oracles.
The oracles, which are what? How did we describe those, B?
The burdens or the judgments against these nations.
Okay, good. And then the group that we had, that we ended up with, the 4 chapters, or was it 24? Yeah, 4 chapters that we ended up with, 24 to 27. How could we put those all together? We haven't done this yet, so. Let's think about 24. That was the chapter that if you mark it, it's really easy to see what it was about. You guys remember that one? That one symbol was there all the time.
I put it as a picture of end times.
Okay. A lot of them are. Is there anything you could get more specific for yourself or to help us out? What was the picture in chapter 24 that really brings this beginning? What did you mark all the time?
Earth.
Earth. Why? What's the point of chapter 24?
The devastation of earth before
Okay,
the Lord reigns.
Yes, the devastation of the earth before the Lord reigns. So between those 4 chapters, you want both those things. So the destruction of the whole earth, but then slash, the Lord will reign. You can even have, he will reign on his mountain in Jerusalem, because we're told that repeatedly. So that's what we will use for the 24 to 27, something like that. Destruction of the whole earth, which starts in chapter 24. But by the time we get through 27, we see a promise more than once that God's going to restore and he's going to reign on his mountain. Good. Okay. So as we think about that, then you guys can get ready with your observation worksheets for 28 and 29, and we'll get ready to see the connection. So as we finish, we just talked about God's going to reign on his mountain, right? And that's actually how chapter 27 ends, is with that promise of people again coming to worship on his mountain in Jerusalem. So the last verses of chapter 27 have that. So keep that in mind as we read 28. We're just going to take these separately this time. And I need 4 different readers for chapter 28 because you're all usually willing to read. Is it okay if I just go with you again in the order that I see you up here? And so the first group of you will end up reading in chapter 28 and the other will do 29. Is that okay? So I have B, if you would read verses 1 through 8. Jasmine, yours will be 9 to 16. Marcy, yours will be 17 to 22. And then I have Melinda, yours will be 23 to 29. And so whenever you're ready, B, you can start us with Isaiah 28.
Woe to the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and to the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is at the head of the fertile valley, of those who are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord has a strong and mighty agent, as a storm of hail, a tempest of destruction, like a storm of mighty overflowing waters. He has cast it down to the earth with his hand. The proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim is trodden underfoot, and the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is at the head of the fertile valley, will be like the first ripe fig prior to summer, which one sees, and as soon as it is in his hand, he swallows it. In that day, the Lord of hosts will become a beautiful crown and a glorious diadem to the remnant of his people, a spirit of justice for him who sits in judgment, a strength to those who repel the onslaught at the gate. And these also reel with wine and stagger from strong drink. The priest and the prophet reel with strong drink. They're confused by wine, they stagger from strong drink. They reel while having visions. They totter when rendering judgment. For all the tables are full of filthy vomit, without a single clean place.
To whom would he teach knowledge? And to whom would he interpret the message? Those just weaned from milk? Those just taken from the breast? For he says, order on order, order on order, line on line, line on line, a little here, a little there. Indeed, he will speak to this people through stammering lips in a foreign tongue. He who said to them, here is rest, give rest to the weary, and here is repose, but they would not listen. So the word of the Lord to them will be, order on order, order on order, line on line, line on line, a little here, a little there, that they may go and stumble backward, be broken, snared, and taken captive. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, O scoffers, who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact. The overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by. For we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am lying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a costly cornerstone for the foundation, firmly placed. He who believes in it will not be disturbed.
And I will make justice the measuring line, and righteousness the level. Then hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the secret place. And your covenant with death shall be canceled, and your pact with Sheol shall not stand. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, then you become its trampling place. As often as it passes through, it will seize you. From morning after morning, it will pass through any time, the day or night, during the day or night. And it will be sheer terror to understand what it means. The bed is too short on which to stretch out, and the blanket is too small to wrap oneself in. For the Lord will rise up on Mount Perazim. He will stir up the valley of Gibeon to do his task, his usual task, and to work, his extraordinary work. And now do not carry on as scoffers, lest you fitter be made stronger. For I have heard from the Lord God of hosts of decisive destruction on all the earth.
Give ear and hear my voice. Listen and hear my words. Does the farmer plow continually to plant seed? Does he continually turn and harrow the ground? Does he not level its surface and sow dill and scatter cumin and plant wheat in rows, barley in its place and rye within its area? For his God instructs and teaches him properly. For dill is not threshed with a threshing sledge, nor the cartwheel driven over cumin. But dill is beaten out with a rod and cumin with a club. Grain for bread is crushed. Indeed, he does not continue to thresh it forever, because the wheel of his cart and his horses eventually damage it. He does not thresh it longer. This also comes from the Lord of hosts, who has made his counsel wonderful and his wisdom great.
I don't know. Are you guys starting to kind of love the poeticness of these chapters instead of, I know sometimes it's harder to kind of grab a hold, but it's just starting to really, I don't know, it's just cool. And if you think about the pictures, they make a lot of sense. So I'm kind of loving it. So let's go back and we'll start our discussion of 28. So just at the end of our review, we said, what were the final words of chapter 27 about? Were they judgment or restoration at the end of 27?
Restoration.
Yeah, coming to God's holy mountain in Jerusalem. All the people will come and worship. Remember, we had that picture of them being threshed out of the nations where they were scattered and perishing. And so they were popping out of there to come and worship at the Lord. So that's how we ended 27. Is the chapter 28 you going to continue with restoration, or does it start with something else? We have a one word that's always our clue. What's the word?
Whoa.
Whoa. I don't have my woe paddle. I don't know what I do with it. But whoa, again, we've gotten used to some woes. Who is the focus of this woe?
The nation Ephraim.
Yeah, what did we say about them? Who is that?
Oh, I know they're part of the northern kingdom and they had a lot of trouble with idolatry and leading others astray.
Okay, so if this word looks familiar to you, remember this Isaiah chapter 7, which we're going to do that extra speaking on. You go back to this a lot. That's the nation. It is the part of the northern kingdom. And the focus in chapter 7 was not only are they having all of the struggles that Esther just told us about, but they also ended up aligning themselves with the king of Damascus and were going to attack their own brethren in Judah. So that's part of the picture. So most of the time we've said, as Isaiah's prophesying, he's a prophet to the southern kingdom, but every now and then you'll see him also being given a word for the northern kingdom when they were divided. So this is an interesting part. One of the things, and I think not next week, I've looked ahead a bit and I got confused about when, but I think within the next 2 lessons, we're going to look historically a little bit at the king that we have now. So we did that with Ahaz. Does anybody remember? They show you at the beginning of every lesson. Do you know who the king is reigning at Judah at this time that Isaiah would be speaking to, or who's leading Judah right now after Ahaz? Hezekiah. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the beginning of every lesson, they have those 2 little charts and it actually has an arrow pointing to who's king. So that's always a place you can go back and look. So at that time, Hezekiah is king of the southern kingdom. And depending on where exactly we are, the northern kingdom is getting very close to being taken captive, right? So they had their own prophet as well, which is Hosea, prophesying to some degree at the same time as Isaiah. So here, the northern kingdom has been warned by their own prophet and by Isaiah about what's going to happen to them. So we need to think about that when we start looking at them historically. Okay, so that was a little bit of background and review. Talking about the woes, this is something you want to think about in terms of application. As we think back, either with the word woe or just with oracles or judgment, you know, who are some of the groups of people, or to whom has God given woes and or judgments so far in the book of Isaiah?
Assyria,
Okay.
Egypt,
Mhm. You don't.
Moab,
Okay, so in chapters 13 to 23, if that overall picture, how could we define those judgments, those oracles? Remember that map? So sort of all of those nations, the ones that B was listing, sort of surrounding Judah at that time. So there was a whole group of nations God has given woes or judgments to. Whom else do we know he has sort of pronounced a general woe on, or a promise of judgment in the book of Isaiah? Who did he start with?
Anybody that came against Israel.
Okay, so that's always, that's there, that would be part of these oracles.
Chapter 14 was the king of Babylon.
Okay, so that they would be included in the 13 to 23, all these nations around. Who did the book start with in terms of God going to bring judgment?
Israel.
Israel, so Judah. So he starts with Judah, his own people. We've seen a picture of all of the surrounding nations, especially anybody who comes against Judah. What about chapter 24? Who is that pronouncement on?
The whole world.
The whole
earth.
world, the earth. So, and what was the reason overall have we been able to see for God bringing judgments to essentially at one time or another, everyone on the earth?
This covenant was broken, it said in 24.
Okay, so with people who had a covenant with him, or even his covenant with the earth, for breaking his covenant, what's another reason we know we get judgment? We used it in our theme for verses 1 to 5.
Sin.
Sin. So not following God, sin, all of those things. We know in these days, God has given one thing that he will use as his judgment on individuals for eternity. And what is that? Now,
Not believe
not
in
believe
him,
in who?
in Jesus.
In Jesus. Okay, so I know I'm grabbing all this. You guys didn't have this as questions, but it's part of what the picture that we've been talking about in bits and pieces. And as always, when we get ready to wrap up a study, I kind of wanting you guys to start to think for that final discussion on what you've learned and what impact, and is it relevant to where we are today? So as we've sort of talked about this picture of God judging nations on sin and whether or not they're following him, if he's judged all of these other nations, as we just spoke on, and promises a destruction on the earth, is there any reason to think that our current world or nation will escape similar judgment?
No.
No.
No, no. And that is a place we just, we want to look at honestly. So that's why I'm bringing that up. You can look and see that no one has been spared this judgment. Now, individuals, again, who believe in Jesus, that's a whole nother thing we'll talk about. But as nations, we see God bringing that promise of judgment, but the restoration to come, which he's also provided in one way. Okay, good. That's all still background. Now, let's go on to what we see here at the beginning of 28, because now again, we see a focus back on his own people, but at this point in the northern kingdom. So if we look at verses 1 through 8, what's the picture we'd see? We know there's a woe. So 1 through 8 will sort of give us the whys and the how to some degree. Why does God give this woe to the northern kingdom?
They're struggling with pride as well.
Okay, pride. We see that word a couple times in there. Yeah, good. What else do you guys see there?
It says overcome with wine.
Okay, there's a lot of references here to wine and drunkenness. What's interesting is that there are Psalms that to the Hebrew people, wine was considered a gift from God, and it was to bring joy and gladness. So it's not a word against that wine at all, but clearly here the word is against this. And we had this back in chapter 5 as well, right? Was that chapter 5, all those other woes to his own people about drinking that too much and to excess and what's happening?
Overcome.
Overcome with it. Good. And we
One of
see
the commentaries, sorry,
Go ahead.
one of the commentaries that I was listening to was saying like wine is also like an image of life to them. It's
Mhm.
wine is, and so it's an idea of, could be an idea of not only drinking, but just indulging in worldly things rather than, especially with the priests and prophets. They're more concerned with the world than they are with God's laws.
I think that is a great picture here that fits exactly his description of what they're doing. And so since you mentioned the priests and the prophets, Kim, would you go ahead and tell us what it does say about them in these verses?
They reel with strong drink. They're confused by wine. They stagger. They reel while having visions, and their tables are full of filthy vomit.
Yeah. And tottering there, it says, even when rendering judgment, right? So even it sounds like in their duties and in the roles that they're there for, having visions, rendering judgment, they're just not. And if we take Kim's thought and take it then, and this is going to fit in as well, when you're overly engaged in the things of the world, then what is not your focus? God, right? And that's the contrast we want to look to see here. Even when it's not there as a contrast, we know he's saying that it's then replacing him. And there'll be some more verses on that as we go through. So he talks about them being a proud crown, right? That they had this pride in themselves. We've seen that many times in this study. And what's going to happen? What is always the picture that we have seen in Isaiah? If something is proud and lifting itself up, what is God going to do? And you see it here in these verses.
Bring it down.
Bring it down, right? You see, he's going to cast it down. And then in the middle of these verses, again, remember the Isaiah picture is that he's given prophecy about the future, and he sees it as future and presents it the way God gives it to him. And so sometimes near future and far future are linked together, and then it's up to us to sort of decipher which time. There's a verse that stands out in here as something that is different than the rest of this judgment and this woe to Ephraim. And you see it in the contrast of once they are cast down, what will happen?
Well, in verse 5, it starts out with the in that day, which to me means in the future. And then it contrasts the proud crowd with a beautiful crown and a glorious diadem.
Mm-hmm. And who will be that? It tells us.
It's given to the remnant of the people of his people.
Yes. In that day,
To the believers.
the Lord of hosts will become. a beautiful crown
Mhm.
and a glory. He
Yes.
will become the beautiful crown, not they themselves. But again, yes, as Esther says, in that day is beginning to be a clue to you that you've probably jumped to another time frame. And if you weren't sure, there's another phrase in there that will tell you, which is what? Who's the promise to that Esther just told us?
To the remnant.
The remnant of his people. This is that promise of the remnant. And again, that was a near fulfillment and a far. God's promising that there's always going to be a remnant of his people, but that promise is for the end time as well. Good. Any other thoughts or questions or insights on those first 8 verses? Okay, so because of that, if you go to verse 9, this is sort of a continuation of what he was talking at the very last verses, talking about those priests and prophets who are reeling and staggering. Then if we look at verse 9, that's the connection to that. If they are like that, then what does God say? What's this next section about?
There's nobody to listen to his teaching because they're all drunken idiots right now.
Okay, good.
Just the babies.
Yes, babies, good. If your leaders are drunken idiots, as Karen said, it says, to whom is God going to give the knowledge or the message? And then you get this picture of babies. Karen, tell us where you see that, because that's a great way to express it.
Just weaned from milk and just taken from the breast. That would be a very young child or baby.
Yes, good. That's what he's saying. To whom is he going to give it to? Those people, the people who are babies yet? And then he uses this phrase that's repeated here. This picture, anybody look up or want to describe to us what's being said in verse 10 and it's repeated in verse 13? This picture continues here.
How God gives his word piece by piece, order on order, line on line, little here, little there.
Yeah, why? What's the picture here? What idea does it continue? Is that how he wants to do it?
Mm.
No.
It's like he's having to spoon feed them. And I found it interesting when I looked up order on order, it was precept on precept or command or order.
Yes, that is true reference. However, that's how we study piece by piece, looking at it. That doesn't make us babies. That's actually fulfilled. Yeah. But what is said here is, if you look at context, this continues the idea from verse 9.
In this situation, it's that they may go and stumble backward, be broken, snared, and taken captive, which is interesting. He can't give them knowledge, and he's trying, but that they may go and stumble backward, be broken, snared, and taken captive. That's interesting, because usually you think of, if you get the knowledge piece by piece, you get it, you move forward, you get more, you move forward. That idea was what I thought that was, but
Yeah.
that part of that verse says that they may stumble,
Yeah.
which is surprising.
Right. So that's going to fit in with where he heads next. Again, it's always so interesting how this goes when you look in context. So that part fits the next, but also verse 10 actually goes with the idea from verse 9. If you look this up in commentary, the idea here is that this is baby talk. So he's saying, because you talk like this, order on order, line on line, it's a babbling baby talk, this kind of phrasing here. He says, if you're going to talk like that, if that's all you have left, then I'm going to speak to you in the same way that you speak back to me. That was sort of the picture that I got. He says, in fact, in verse 12, if you look, he said, here is rest, give rest to the weary. Here is repose. What's the contrast in verse 12? Here it is.
They won't listen.
Jasmine. Yeah, Jasmine, you're on mute.
Yeah, just the but there. here's this, but they won't listen.
But they would not listen. Anybody remember what Isaiah was told in chapter 6 when he was commissioned and sent on his way? And here's a message to give them. What else did God say?
But they will not listen.
They won't listen. I'm telling you in advance, they won't listen. Here it is again. God has said, here's rest, here's repose, but they wouldn't listen. So then verse 13 says, so this is how his word will be to them. If you're going to just want baby talk, you can have baby talk. And then as Barb said, you get the that they may go. They will stumble back, be broken, snared, and taken captive.
I'm always amazed how when we're just starting to talk things out, I connect things and think things, because it was always so frustrating to me. And when I read 6 about, I'm going to give you this mission, but it's not going to make any difference. It's not.
Yeah.
Well, why are you doing this to this poor man? And then I thought, for you, Kim, so that you can see, I warned them, I told them, I'm showing you here, Kim, exactly what I told them would happen. Now you can see that I'm faithful. I've told them word, and it's like, oh, I'm just getting chills thinking about it. It's for you. It's for us to look and see. They were told, this is what God said. This is exactly what he did hundreds of years later. And so the stuff that isn't fulfilled in here, he's going to fulfill it. Kim, because he did what he said he was going to do.
Yeah.
It must have been so frustrating for Isaiah, but it's like he's so blessed now. It's like, oh, look, I can see a whole group of people that now know you because of me. This is good.
Hey, that's a great thought for poor Isaiah. That's really good. That is a great consolation, hopefully, to him. And I would just keep that note, Kim, for yourself for the end of study application we talk about, because that'll take you right to the New Testament. That is it in Romans where Paul says that these words of the scriptures, these Old Testaments, have been given to you for instruction, right? And that is so perfect that is for us to see and learn from, but also you got both parts, right? That also watching the prophecy and knowing these things happened, that they were fulfilled, makes us confident that those that are yet to come will be fulfilled as well. And that is great application there. Other thoughts on those verses?
One of my commentaries had said that one of the reasons why they wouldn't accept the message, because it was just like another rule to follow, like the order on order, line on line, and it just kind of went over their head.
Okay.
They didn't want to listen to it.
Yeah, they didn't want to listen. Yeah, I think we can always come back to God knowing their hearts, which of course he knew in advance of what he would say. Good. Okay. Verse 14 starts with therefore, so we know it's connected to what he just said. I found this really interesting, and it's a couple places in these chapters. Okay, here's the horrible things I know you're going to do. I know you're not going to listen. Therefore, and then it's always followed by a great promise, right? And I just think, wow, God, every time you see us mess up, you tell us, we mess up, and we're going to mess up. And then therefore, hear this word, I'm going to give you a great promise. And I just think, wow. So this word goes to who's listed here. Again, it's always interesting if you grab a hold of all these different categories of people, right? So we've had the Ephraim, we've seen a focus on their priests and prophets. Who's the focus now in verse 14?
Golfers.
Yeah, the
People in
scoffers
Jerusalem.
who do what in Jerusalem?
Rule.
Who rule, right? You scoffers ruling in Jerusalem. So again, we can see this picture of not having good leadership happening at this time. What does it look to you like they have done according to verse 15? It actually gets clearer when you see God take it away in the next chapters, but what are we going to take from what's being said in verse 15?
To me, it means that they're making a pact with other nations. That they're looking to, like they look to Assyria to get them out of a problem. They're not
Good.
looking to God.
Good. And again, if you go backwards here, it can kind of help you. So that's great because that takes our context, right? They've made a covenant with death, it says, and a pact with Sheol. Well, one thing you know for sure, is that going to be a, whatever you know about it, first of all, is that going to be with God or not with God? Not with God. So that's the first thing you know right there, is right? They've done something that instead of God, they've done this other thing. So then if you look, we have made falsehood our refuge and we have concealed ourselves with deception. Now think about what Esther said, right? In what ways have they done that? In what ways have they made falsehood a refuge and concealed themselves with deception? If you think about how have they handled their difficulties, their struggles? If you think back everything that both Ephraim and Judah have been said, Barb?
They lied. That would be the falsehood. So they built a web of lies to protect themselves, and deception, and so lies and deception, and they've like built a fortress around themselves, so they think.
So they think, yeah. And again, how does that connect to what Esther told us about them with, for example, going to the king of Assyria, which Ahaz did? What are some of the things they've relied on instead of God? We can think of a lot of them here, probably. What are some of the things that they have put their trust in, right? This is going to come down to belief and trust and faith. Where have they been placing that instead of in God?
In other countries. and-
Okay, that's one. So in these other nations that they thought were powerful enough to help them. Jasmine?
I think also in themselves, God's continual woe to them relates to their pride. And they just think the line, the overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by, just to me is like, we're God's chosen people. That's not gonna afflict us. We're good. Let's just drink wine and have a party, and let's not do what we need to do, and not take our sacrifices and things seriously, but we just do them because it's tradition, and that's not going to happen.
Good. So yeah, so they have placed trust in other leaders or other nations. They've placed trust in themselves. Any other things that's making you guys think about? What's part of the picture when they follow other nations? What do they usually end up also following?
Other gods.
Idols.
Both of you said the same thing. Yeah, other gods or idols, right? So they're putting their faith almost everywhere but in God, including in their own leadership, which makes sense to do that, these leaders, but we can see that that's not working for them. You still have to look and know what God says so that you can compare. Then everywhere else should fall short of what God says when it's not lining up. So this is the picture. They have made falsehood a refuge, concealed ourselves with deception. Do you think that that is something that we ever do? And if so, how do we do that? What's the picture look like for you or for me or for somebody if we would say we're falsehood is a refuge and we've concealed ourselves with deception? How do we hide under falsehood and deception?
Not accepting the truth
Strong,
of
no one-
situations.
Okay, Kim?
I said, we're America, we're strong, we have a great military, no one can hurt us.
Okay, that could definitely be a picture as well. As a nation, we could be thinking that.
Another one is, oh, I'm a Christian. Oh, I can just do this, then I'll just confess it later and be okay. Well, no.
Yeah, that sort of sounds like the same thing Jasmine was saying about we can party and not worry about it. Yeah, instead of looking like we follow God or being set apart. Yep. Any other ways anybody can think of that you might hide under falsehood or hide under deception?
I think nowadays, the two, it's if I just keep quiet, if I just don't say anything, they won't come for me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, yeah, and that again, what we want to look at here as you continue to think application for the end of this semester is in all of these falsehoods and all these things that we rely on, in where is the enemy likely to take a foothold? And then how will he take those things and get you from a little bit of fear or a little bit of hiding into completely unuseful and then following completely wrong people just because you're looking for safety on the earth. And again, this goes to where my thinking is in terms of what I'm going to talk about next week versus security with God. If we're trying to hide and we hide by not keeping that full truth, think about what we've talked about over the past few weeks in terms of our real world situation. And remember what he told Ahaz, that first point is take heed, which in my mind, I've called pay attention, right? And you can see that so clearly in that picture with Ahaz, is that Ahaz knew and had to know what was coming against him before he could look to see what God was wanting him to do. So we had lots of pictures of that. And that's what I see here as well for me, that I can look and I have to know the truth in order to be able to battle the truth, to battle the lies, instead of hiding under the lies, even because the lies look really popular, right? The more popular and easy the lies look, then how much easier is it to believe those instead of to believe truth? And so that's something you can think about in terms of where we are. And hiding in general is very easy to want to do, right? When time is hard. Any other thoughts on that before we go to his great promise? I like how these tie together when we ended verse 13, where he said, you'll stumble backward and be broken, snared and taken captive. Now think of those as he gets ready to make this promise. Again, I find this so interesting. You've made a covenant with death and a pact with Sheol, and you've focused and given your faith to all kinds of other things. So therefore, I'm going to give you this great promise. And I always think, why, God? Why? It's the contrast, right? He wants to show them what beautiful picture do we get here in the next couple verses in verse 16.
A cornerstone.
Yeah, the cornerstone. Now, we probably have some thoughts on the cornerstone, even for people who've maybe been going to church or listening to music for a while, but don't know a lot about the Bible. You've probably heard of the cornerstone because it's a popular component in songs, right? There's a lot of songs about the cornerstone. There's churches named after the cornerstone. So we want to look, but first we're going to look to see, just according to verse 16, what do you learn about this cornerstone? Just from that one verse in Isaiah here.
Tested, it's costly, it's firmly placed in the foundation, and he who believes in it will not be disturbed.
Perfect. That's it. That is a
God
great
is
list.
placing it in Zion.
Yes, God placed it. Good addition there on that. As we get ready to look at some of those words, I'm going to think about that. He who believes. So he who believes will not be disturbed. And now he's talking about faith in this instead of this picture of what they have been doing. And so I went and I looked at this. I was going to look at the words of this verse here. And the first place I ended up was actually in just in the parallel. And I wanted to show you guys just when you look at this in parallel verses, just the words will not be disturbed. You don't even really end up having to go to the concordance because this is so amazing. Just in parallel, when you see what people say about it. And so I'm going to see if I can bring these up, because I just grabbed a few of them to show you. So just for the you will not be disturbed, this is what some of the translations put instead. They said, never stricken with panic, never be shaken, not act hastily, not give way in sudden panic, and be unshakable. And so that's just what different translations put instead of you will not be disturbed if you believe in him. And I just thought that is an amazing list of what I would have just sort of called peace, right? That's how we kind of went the other way, that I would have said not be disturbed. Of course, it means you have peace, but you have peace because these things. And so when you, the reason they got all these different translations is because when you look at the word not be disturbed in the concordance, it actually has and conveys all of these ideas, which we sort of miss out on when we just say not be disturbed. I think those are so easy for us to overlook sometimes. Phrases like, oh, if you believe, you will not be disturbed. This is pretty strong. Does anybody want to not be shaken and not give way in sudden panic? Does that ever sound like something that you need to have happen? I see some of you guys writing these down. Do you need another second with that slide up? Let me leave it there. What does somebody like about those? Somebody who's not still writing. What do you think about that list?
Never stricken with panic. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then not give way in it, right? Not give way in the sudden panic. There's such a picture of calm to me that really then I think describes the not disturbed.
I like the not act hastily, which takes my emotions out of the equation.
Yeah, that's good. And that's what we can do here instead. Is everybody good with that? The list? Okay. Yeah, I like that description of taking our emotions out, because, you know, I can get to this place a lot of times, but it's usually after I've started these things like panic or giving way, and then you can get to the calm. And it would just be great to just have this so strongly that it doesn't even start to get to you. Like, that's the place, the idea that I love here is that I can prevent it from ever starting instead of having to fix it later. Now, just for our review, this all comes if you do what?
You believe.
You believe in this cornerstone. And then when you go ahead now, you see this list, and then you look at how God describes the cornerstone, you can see the connection, right? What is it that we, by relying in the cornerstone, what about it keeps us from having all these other things disturb us?
Because we're firmly placed. We can keep our eyes on him.
Yes. Is he going to move or ever be shaken?
No.
No, that picture, right? Foundation firmly placed. That's what a cornerstone is. It holds everything together, right? So it's not going to move. You guys looked at a bunch of cross references, and I think it's early on. I don't have the page number. If you want to open to those that we looked up, a lot of them might have been familiar to some of you. It looks like
135.
135, thank you, and 136. In Isaiah 8, let's start with that one. I don't know if we'll cover all of them, but we had this one already. What did you learn by looking at Isaiah 8? Because it gives us that contrasting picture, which he also talks about in this verse as well. There's a twofold picture of this cornerstone.
The
If you
Lord of
believe-
hosts is a stone to strike and a rock to trip over.
Okay, so if there's this two thing that happens, right? If you believe he's a firm foundation to you and will give you all this peace and keep you firm. If you don't, what's the picture you get there from Isaiah 8 and some of the other places? Then what happens? What do will you just explain that for us, Karen?
Then the stone's a problem because I don't know, it's kind of in your way. It's contrary to the other things that you've been believing.
Okay, good. I think that's a great way to describe it. It becomes what's described as a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. Even then in Romans 9:33, he's quoting the verse we just looked at in Isaiah 8, right? This is Paul in Romans quoting Isaiah 8 about those who will stumble on him. But if you believe, he gives another contrast. Did anybody put that part down? What happens if you would believe instead of stumble?
You'll never be put to shame.
Good. Psalm 118:22 is another place in the Old Testament where this is mentioned. What addition do you learn about it in Psalm 118 that then we're going to see some of the New Testament authors quote as well?
The stone which the builder rejected has become the chief cornerstone.
Okay, that the builders reject, but has become the chief cornerstone. Then you saw a long parable in Matthew, which is, again, I think we've talked about this one before because it's interesting in terms of the other picture that God's given about Israel in Isaiah in chapters 5 and some other ones. What was the parable about in terms of the stone or the cornerstone? What did you learn about that? Because at first it doesn't feel like it's about it. You have to read through it till you get to Jesus's, remember Jesus's words here about the cornerstone. What point do you think he's making with this parable?
You don't want it, I'm going to give it to somebody else.
Okay, good. That's good. And he used that picture of a vineyard, remember? And so there's all kinds of tie-ins to Israel and what we've already seen. But that is essentially what it says, that it was given to you. You don't want it. It will become the one for other people. And again, the picture there, you might have grabbed the parts that talk about for those who don't believe, it becomes something that will either crush you or you'll fall on it and be broken, or it will fall on you and crush you. Any thoughts or questions? Anybody else have other impact on the Matthew parable? Okay, then in Acts, Peter goes on to talk about it. And there's one really important point that he makes about this cornerstone. What do you get from Acts 4, verses 8 to 12?
Said that Jesus was the stone the builders rejected, and then goes on to say that salvation is found in no one else.
Okay, perfect. So now we've had allusions to a cornerstone that based on context, we would believe to be Jesus. But Peter tells us clearly, this man that you rejected and crucified is the cornerstone. And that's where salvation is. So Peter makes it definite. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay, I'm just sort of looking at just the idea that the level of things we have to discuss in these two chapters, I'm just telling you right now, we're going to be late. We're never going to get done. It's just amazing to me. So the idea that you could even discuss this picture from Daniel 2 with some people who may not have ever even had a clue what is in Daniel and what Daniel's about. We don't have to know all of it, but you have this great passage in Daniel chapter 2, which is with a very interesting reference to a stone. Can anybody succinctly describe to us what's being spoken about here in Daniel chapter 2 and what it has to do with what we're talking about?
King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. There was a giant statue. There were several different, head was different than the chest, and that was different than the legs and the toes. And then at the end of it, a giant stone comes out of nowhere and crushes it. basically. And
Yes.
Daniel explains to him what each of the kingdoms was, and then says, finally, there will be a kingdom that God will set up. And that's what the stone is, because it wasn't hewn by human hands. It comes out of nowhere. It's a kingdom that God makes, and it will crush the kingdoms of men. But that stone, that kingdom it sets up, will endure forever.
Yes.
That's my brief little summary.
Very good, very good. Obviously, there's tons of detail in there, but that's it essentially. And what it meant prophetically, again, you can go look at on your own. But that at the end, a kingdom will be set up over all other kingdoms, and it will reign, and it will be the kingdom forever. Did anybody who looked at it, do you have any other questions about it, or did you all get that part of it? As long as you get that last part, you're good to go. But again, remember, this was prophecy spoken thousands of years ago. That, yeah, there it is, right? And the promise of Jesus, but then also when he comes back. Okay, I think we still have at least one more. First Peter, Peter talks about it again. And what point did you get from 1 Peter 2, 6 to 8? Anything different, or? A little bit more. Go ahead, Karen.
I think it was the same as the other verse, right? To you who believe, the stone's precious, but to those of you who don't, it's a stumbling block.
Yep, good. You see that contrast in really easy language from Peter, making it really clear. Precious if you believe. And again, those other ones being called disobedient, so being added in there, but those same words, a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. You see Isaiah being just quoted repeatedly by these authors. Okay.
And Chris, one thing that again is striking me as I'm reading through with all of you is that therefore in 16. So you go back and look, and it's because the rulers have made they're trying to lead the people astray. The rulers have made falsehoods and made covenants. And so it's like, God's like, I'm going to put the cornerstone, I'm going to give the people something else. And maybe even if the rulers don't accept it, the people can. You know, there is going to be salvation if you recognize it, type thing. That's, I was like, oh, therefore go to.
Really good. Thank you. That helps me. Thank you. First, God does a lot of things that we don't believe or don't understand or don't deserve. But yes, that would make really good sense there with the focus on the leaders. We know that they're staggering around drunk and scoffing, right? Scoffing is a really serious thought here when you think about who's doing it in Isaiah and you think about today. You think about the religious leaders of God's people actually mocking God's word and what's going to happen with those people. Which takes me to some ideas and some notes that I had about Isaiah and lined up with Hosea and Habakkuk of all places, and about that very topic about the people will perish for lack of knowledge. And actually, I think we got asked that question in the homework, and that's what made me go to these other places that talk about it. But we won't have time to talk about it. So maybe on your own, you can think about it. Okay, so going on, God also says some other things will happen in addition to him being the cornerstone. What will happen in verse 17? He describes more of the positive. What else will it mean at that time that the cornerstone will be there? What's he going to do?
He will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the level.
Okay. What will change compared to what they were doing? Remember this, he's going to go on and talk about this pact and this covenant they made and this refuge. What does he say about this refuge they have made? What's the refuge of?
Refuge of lies.
Yeah.
And the
And
lies
what?
all over the secret place.
Okay, so with two different things, he's going to remove those. What's he going to use to sweep away the refuge of lies?
Hail,
And what's he going to use to remove the secret place?
waters.
Hail and waters. Again, God using natural things. Hang on to that. It's going to tie into this picture he's giving in these other verses. So what's going to happen to that covenant with death and the pact with Sheol that he said that they were making or had made because of their reliance on other things?
They will not stand.
So he's going to do away with that, which is the good news. He's going to take that away for them. However, the rest of the picture of 18 to 22, what else does that mean for them, though? That they're not going to have this deal that they made with others is not going to stand. But what's still going to happen?
The overwhelming scourge is gonna seize them.
And where's that going to come from? Who's it going to come from?
From God.
From God. Okay, so that thing that you made that you're relying on is not going to happen. However, right, so you relied on other nations. You've made a pact and a covenant with death essentially by not following God, and he's not going to let that stand because he knows they've already got covenant with him. However, as judgment for that, there's going to be this time they're going to walk through. You may say the overwhelming scourge, which they said before is not going to touch us. He says when it passes through, this is what's going to happen. And then he describes it. There's nothing there. He goes to give this picture in verse 21. And I think you looked up these places, or did I just look them up? I think I just looked them up, right? Does anybody know what the events are that happened at Mount Perazim and in the Valley of Gibeon that he's comparing this to? It says he will rise up as he did in those places. Did anybody look? Or no? Okay, so these are Old Testament events that happened. There's one of two things, and they're both really interesting. It's possible that you can use 1 Chronicles 14 and 2 Samuel 5 to cover both. So some commentators think that both events happen there. So at Mount Perazim, these were both essentially battles of David against the Philistines. And what do you think in that case? Did God rise up and fight with David and his people against the Philistines in both those accounts? Marcy's nodding yes. So yes, that would be the case that you would see. Is that, and actually Mount Perazim, this is what's interesting, is a breaking of the waters to overflow. Now think about what he said in verse 17. That waters are going to overflow the secret place. God is really tying this all together here. This picture, when you look at these events, is pretty amazing. So in Perazim was one of the cases where God said, yes, I will go with you, go battle them. The second one, he said, don't go battle them, but sit and listen. And it's the account where they hear marching up in the trees, and it's as if, so God is essentially battling against them and around them. But what's also interesting is that the other event that happened at Gibeon, that some people think it's with Joshua, based in Joshua 10, where Joshua faced an army in Gibeon and God battled for him. And did anybody look this one up? God conquered that enemy with hailstones. So I'm wondering if it's the two different accounts, and why would I think maybe it's the Joshua account for the second event? I think maybe because of verse 17.
This is the hail.
The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies. So at Mount Perazim, that even that word means an overflowing of water. And then Gibeon, God used hailstones that he threw down on the enemy. So again, commentators vary on which accounts they think, but all the stories are perfectly suited here. So in 21, as he talks about the scourge coming against his own people, that they're still going to go through that, it's going to come from him. And it says, like these two events, and then it describes he's going to rise up, he's going to do his unusual task and his extraordinary work. What is that about? What does it mean here? What's the picture we're supposed to get from these verses in 17 to 22 about what God will do against Ephraim?
Well, I kind of looked up the unusual task and the extraordinary work, and basically it is strange, foreign, unfamiliar. It's as if dealing with enemies and something just totally out of the norm and truly extraordinary.
Yes. So why would what he's going to do here be described that way, do you think? And it's in context with 21 and these two other battles where God rose up and he battled for his people against another enemy. What makes what he's going to do unusual work? Which side is God going to fight on in this scourge?
The losing side.
Yeah, well, God's side's always the winning side, I guess. But yes.
Well, they're
is
getting
he-
trampled.
Yes, he's trampling his own people with these people, which isn't news to us, right? He's done that. But that's the picture we're supposed to get here, is that in these other accounts, Israel, I battled with you, for you, against these other nations. Picture Philistines, right? You all probably get a picture of a certain picture when you think that. I battled for you against them and defeated them. Now, the way that I rose up against them, I am going to do again. However, I am doing it against you, not them, with other nations against you in the way that I conquered your enemies. What do you guys think of that? We've seen that picture, but somehow that idea here to me seems just, it's devastating in his own words, right? As if they have become like enemies of God to him. And have they become like that?
Mhm.
Yes, if they've
Because
aligned
he
themselves.
describes them again as scoffers.
Yes, good. And yes, don't carry on as scoffers. And then Isaiah says, for I have heard from God. So again, if you're trying to tie up 17 to 22, you get the picture, you know that it's negative because of the final phrase of verse 22, which is, Isaiah has heard from God of what?
Decisive destruction on the whole earth.
Yes, which takes us right back to chapter 24, right? Decisive destruction. I mean, that's a pretty clear phrase, right? Decisive destruction. Is there going to be any doubt about that destruction?
Yeah. You know, something I found interesting, because they
Yeah.
were falsehood and deception were like their places, but it was too short on which to stretch out, and the blanket's too small to wrap oneself in. You put
Yeah.
those two verses together, and it's like it's not even sufficient. Your lies,
Yep.
and to put those two verses, I didn't see that previously. That verse specifically is talking about the things that they were looking to for their safety provision and all that,
Yeah.
the lies and deception.
Yep. Perfect. You're trying to hide under blankets and beds, and they're not even covering you. You're trying to hide under them, and they're not even big enough to cover. They aren't even working. They're not working, which again, if you go to well, Psalms, I think there's something I'm thinking about. God says you, and even through here, you rely on other things and they're too weak to do what you're asking them to do. And all you have to do is come to me. But instead, you're relying on Egypt and Assyria, and they're too weak to take care of you. But they keep doing it. This is so crazy in time today. It's even worse than Tuesday night. So I am not even going to pretend to have us start 29. I'll deal with that in a couple of minutes. But let's, I kind of think, well, maybe we could skip the verses on destruction, but there's some really cool parts you get to when you focus on the cross references for destruction. So let's go ahead and talk about that since we're here. You looked up, and these are page 137 and 138. You looked at a bunch of references on destruction, and first starting back in Isaiah 10, what did we focus on there? What did you learn by looking back, that reminder of Isaiah 10, 20 to 25 when you were focused on destruction?
The destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. A complete destruction.
Good. And then determined is repeated, which I don't know if you remember, but it takes us back to Daniel talking about a destruction that was decreed and determined by God for his people, a picture of one that's still yet to come. So we see, again, this decisive, determined destruction from God. Then they just kind of asked you, they didn't have you review it, but we looked a few weeks ago at seals, trumpets, and bowls mentioned in Revelation, and then this focus in Daniel 7. Was there to you any kind of comparison between this destruction we've seen described in Isaiah 24 and now described? In what way to you was it similar or was it not similar?
I wrote down it was similar because God shows his power, but the people don't yield to it. So the destruction keeps coming. And it's swift and complete destruction.
Okay, good. And one that goes to the whole earth. So it seems to line up with some of what he's talking about. And then though, we have this picture in Revelation 3:10, which is one of the reminders we want to have, and one of the positives that we get to take for believers as we may approach a time, if we're approaching a time of judgment or destruction. What is the promise that you get in Revelation 3:10?
That if you keep his word, you'll be kept from the hour of testing.
Okay, good. This trial that's going to come upon the whole earth. So it seems to describe, again, the same time frame of a destruction of the whole earth. But those who keep to his word will be kept from the hour of trial. Any thoughts or questions on that? I'd love to talk about it for a whole lesson, but questions or thoughts? Okay, so that's a promise to believers, right? For times of destruction. Okay. Okay. Verses 23 to 29 sort of line up with this idea. They sort of line up with that idea of being preserved through a time of trial, and also some of the promises that God has given to Israel throughout the book of Isaiah so far. What do you take, or what is verses 23 to 29 about? And if you weren't sure, by the time you get close to the last section, you probably kind of got the gist of it. But what is he saying here with this farming picture that he gives us?
I summed it up by saying, listen to my word, which is God speaking, and I will teach you properly, because the other stuff they're throwing out there was kind of foolish things. If you didn't know what you were doing, or if a drunken idiot taught you, this would be how you would take care of your crops.
Okay, Good. So that's definitely a part of the picture. Listen to his wise counsel instead of everything else. And then
I
there's,
put also, he is wonderful in counsel and magnificent in wisdom.
okay, good. That's the reason we should listen to him. There's a picture here of this, what's happening to these herbs and plants, and then what isn't going to happen to them.
Well, they're crushed and they're threshed and they're all these things. The cartwheel drives over things, or it's beaten with a rod or human with a club, but it's not threshed forever. And the wheel of his cart doesn't damage it, you know, things like that. So there's a time of uncomfortableness, shall we say, for the herb, but then they're, you know, they're reaped, they're harvested, and they're used.
Yes, perfect. So we can take this to be for sure for his remnant, right? It lines up with that there is going to be destruction and crushing and threshing, and it will be uncomfortable, but that remnant will come through. And also in light of Revelation 3:10, in terms of believers on the earth through times of judgment, if they come, when they come, that it may be uncomfortable, but God will preserve you and protect you either from not being there or through it, right? Okay, thoughts or questions or impacts on that chapter? I can't believe we didn't discuss a whole chapter. You want to discuss it in 10 minutes? Which essentially I think we did Tuesday night, but let's go for it. I think we can do it. We'll do the overall general view of it, because if I try to add it to our discussion next week when we're discussing like 3 or 4 chapters, I don't think we'll ever get to discuss it. But just let's go to the overall picture of 29. New woe, right, is what starts it. Who's it directed at this time? Because I want to make sure that in case anybody needs the clarification that we clarify here. Who's this woe directed at in chapter 29? We won't have time to read the chapter out loud, but
Jerusalem.
now we're back to Jerusalem. So Ariel, you can tell from the context, is the city of Jerusalem. And that's what's being described. So again, now we're back to the people that Isaiah's been talking to through the book. If you look at the first set of verses, what's the picture? I guess it's a picture that always goes with woe, but
It's like a complete devastation, and it's God doing it. He's going to encircle them. He's going to put siege work against them. So he's using other powers to do it, but it's going to be him. And then you'll be brought low. From the earth you will speak, from the dust where you are prostrate. It's like the spirit from the grounds. It's like, you know, basically to me, it was like complete devastation.
okay.
This would be like that of a spirit from the ground, like a mutter from dust.
Good, good. And then Kim gave the insight to another part of the picture. God's doing this, using other nations. What's the other promise that comes through the next set of verses about those other nations? What's going to happen to them?
They get theirs.
They get theirs.
Be
Good.
blessed.
They get theirs. So again, God saying that his promise that if you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. If you curse Israel, you'll be cursed, is going to continue. He's going to rise up these nations to fight against Israel and Jerusalem on his behalf, and then he's going to destroy them when he's done with them. Good. And you would get that like by the end of verse 8, you would see, thus will be to the nations who wage war against Mount Zion. The next section sort of describes the people again and why this woe has come against them. So if you were to look starting at verse 9, you'd see some familiar language that was used in Isaiah 28 against Samaria, Ephraim. What's been going on with them? This time he uses the same language, but it's not exactly the same. What are they like, according to verse 9?
They're drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink, because the Lord's poured over them a spirit of deep sleep. And shut
Okay.
their eyes.
Good. Again, you remember, I mean, we even talked about this, similar things in the book of John, God doing this, but doing it at times when they've already blinded themselves, which it says here, then he continues that for a time. Good. And the picture's given that they're so blinded and so out of it that you can put a book in front of two kinds of people. You can put a book in front of people who know how to read and a book in front of people who don't know how to read. And essentially, what result will you get from both those groups of people?
Can't read it.
They can't read it. So this vision of blindness and a vision of not understanding, which you start to see in the next picture, is what he's talking about. In fact, he says a word that you might want to use. One of them is, well, the verses in 13 are amazing. Yeah, what does he say there? There was another one. I'm sure we're going to get to it. We'll have you. Oh, there they are. Okay. What's the picture he says about them? I think, Jasmine, in your earlier remarks today about something else, you kind of hit on this topic. What are they like here in verse 13?
Yeah, they're just kind of going through the motions because it's what they're supposed to do, but they don't have the heart behind what they're doing. And
Yeah.
so they speak a lot and they say what they're supposed to say, and they're just giving God lip service, basically, which is interesting.
Yeah.
verbiage.
Yeah, I think that's,
Yeah,
I thought,
that-
I
I
bet
like
that's, go ahead. Go ahead,
I like
Barb.
that phrase, tradition learned by rote.
Yep.
You know, it's like, well, this is what I would do because this is the way I learned it, but I don't have it in here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we got the phrase lip service right here out of the Bible. There's so many expressions that people use, they don't even actually know they're biblical, but God calls it lip service when you say something with your mouth that sounds right, but in your heart, you're not doing the truthful heart thing. Therefore, he says, once again, he will deal marvelously with these people. Again, this is more the idea of a surpassing extraordinary act. When we see marvelous, we probably think nice and positive. This may not be the best interpretation of the word marvelous, or it might be. It might be the promise of Jesus and restoration. It depends on which part we go to here in context. So the wisdom, the wise and discerning people of their time, people who think they're wise, what's going to happen with them, or has even? In verse 14, when he talks about wisdom and discernment.
Their wisdom's going to perish.
Okay, and then he gives another woe, starting in verse 15. Who's the woe directed at here?
Those who hide their plans from the Lord and whose deeds are done in a dark place.
Yep, that's the first part there. I don't know, is anybody else taken right back to John 3 with Nicodemus and the whole thing about deeds done in the dark and deeds done in the light? Just really made me think, what's the second part of this woe? So one is for people trying to hide their deeds. What's the second part? What have they done?
They question whether God can even see them, but they regard themselves as the authority rather than God. And boy, don't you see that. I mean, I see that with a certain person in my life that says, well, I know God says that, but I don't agree. And it's like, what? That doesn't even make any sense. You know God.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase. So that's an interesting but. We get a lot of interesting buts throughout the way we think. But yep, that's essentially it here exactly. Verse 16, you turn things around, right? You say, we're God and not God. We know better. Should we be considered equal? He has no understanding is what they would say about God, which is essentially what Barb just said, somebody she knows would say. God doesn't understand. He doesn't actually know.
I basically said, woe to those who are their own authority.
Very good.
Mm.
Great. Yeah, perfect. You know, how long is that going to work for you? You know, when we try that, does that work forever? No, because don't we all hit a day where what we know just doesn't work? And then we go turn in looking somewhere else, right? We mess up and we think, oh, well, I'll go find that answer somewhere else. But the answer's already there. It's already there and we just miss it. So he gives promise again in the next section. He gives promise and also, yeah, we see interesting thoughts here. The promise of all this hidden darkness, deeds done in the dark, the concealed. You can kind of see this idea even carrying from chapter 28 about the concealing and the refuge of lies, that eventually he says, out of gloom and darkness, their eyes, the blind will see. I mean, this really sounds like those chapters in John. It really does sound like it to me. Chapter 3, and then later, I think in whichever one with the blind man. What will happen someday? Let's talk about the good part here, the description of this one day. What's going to happen?
The ruthless will come to an end and the scoffers will be finished.
Okay, good. That's going to end. And then what's the other picture throughout the list of people given here?
The fertile field, the forest, the deaf will hear, the eyes will see, the blind will see, afflicted will increase in gladness in the Lord, the needy of mankind will rejoice in the Holy One of Israel, ruthless come to an end, and the bad come to an end, but all those good things too, to people
Yes.
that are needy.
Right. So that picture of restoration, and here in verse 21, when he says the ruthless and the scorner will be finished, you know, this verse 21 really spoke to me. It sounded like today to me. What's described as being evil, those doing evil will be cut off. And then he describes what it means to do evil. Evil would be causing a person to be indicted by a word. Does that sound like cancel culture at all? That people are saying something, and if you just say something that a certain group of people do not agree with, you're done. You are just done. You might even lose your job. You might even go to jail. I've seen cases where something tweeted years ago, the police knocking at their door and took them in because somebody said it was a threat. And it wasn't, but it happened years ago, and this is happening. So the same thing, people who defraud the one in the right with meaningless arguments. People who don't even have meaning behind what they say are defrauding the people in the right. When God describes people in the right, he would be describing people who are in the right because of him. Being right, being upright always means be right with God. And so that is happening, was what God called evil. So when we start to wonder today, if you know people that are wondering, well, some of these things, this sounds good, it sounds right, it sounds nice, is it or is it not? So this is a verse, and there's lots of these same verses in Proverbs and in Psalms where God describes things that are done with people's words. I can't think of the right word, but yeah. Did anyone else have those thoughts about that verse? It's sounding like.
I looked up the word for meaningless arguments, and I just wrote down on my thing, confusion and unreality was what were two of the other synonyms for it.
Good.
And I thought that's where I feel a lot of times now. It's like it's not real what you're saying, and yet you're making this argument about it. It's like it doesn't, and then I get confused because I'm like, so it's like this whole deception.
Yeah, that is a picture of deception. And again, when we talk about, God uses the word evil here, and so we know that God is not a God of confusion. So any of these arguments that instead of aligning people actually divide and cause confusion are probably not from God. And the enemy is going to get in there and can continue to divide and confuse his people. Okay, what does the end have for us here? The last 22 to 24. Part of it we talked about in these promises that will come. Well, no, we didn't talk about that part. What's going to happen, and this will help you again with the time frame of the end of 29.
It's a kind of redemption. Jacob doesn't have to be ashamed of his people anymore because they're going to sanctify his name and stand in awe of God.
Okay, good. So they will stand in awe of the God of Israel, and then tied back into these other thoughts about not hearing, not seeing. If you look back through 28 and 29, people who don't hear, people who don't see, people who can't read or understand. God ends with verse 24, those who err in mind will know the truth, and those who criticize will accept instruction. So yeah, if
And
you
when I looked up the beginning of those words, Chris, those who err, it was the wayward and wander in intoxication, which sort of referred back to that. And then, yeah, I thought that was neat.
Yeah, really interesting. And so again, a promise that you might have to deal with battling against falsehood and against what's really the truth today. But God says there will come a day when those who err in mind will know the truth, and those who criticize will accept instruction. But we have to live in that time. We have to walk through it. So just real quick, again, I've alluded to it a couple times, that as we approach the end of a study, so we have 3 lessons left, it really would be a good time if you start thinking about, what have you learned? You know, what has God shown you personally from Isaiah? A couple ways you could think of it. Some of you might want to think back to, what were your expectations or thoughts when we were going to begin the book of Isaiah? You know, what did you think about studying this Old Testament book of prophecy? Then what impact has that had? And have you found it to be relevant? And if you have, how? So that'd be one way, or one thing. If those questions don't have an immediate connection or response, or you don't really think of anything, one other really good thing to do would be to go back to the beginning page of every lesson, which started with a question focus every week. And I'm pretty sure somewhere in there, one of those at least will probably have had a week where you go, oh yeah. And so that would be something. And so it would be good somewhere to just jot a few notes down for discussion for that. So again, when you spend as much time and effort in going through a study of God's word, you want to make sure you walk away with that part of, what did it mean to me? And one of the other things I would encourage us right now is that, in addition to knowing what it meant to you, would you be able to describe how or why to someone else? Would you be able to explain to someone else, hey, yeah, I did just spend all that time studying the book of Isaiah, or the first half of it, and this is what God showed me, and it's helping me, or it's taught me. Can you explain it to somebody else? That would be a good way to go with that. Okay, I think we are done with recording. So if you've been watching us, thank you. Hey, everybody, wave and say hi to everybody watching online this week. And we want you to know that we pray for you. If you're watching us, and if you do watch, write a comment. We'd love to know that you're watching. So we think about you, we pray for you, and we just want you to know that. So have a good week, everybody. Okay, everybody, we had some technical difficulties today when I was starting. So I had some intro information before class started, and that all disappeared because I lost my internet connection. So here at the end, I'm just going to put up this slide about our part 2 study, which we will start as a class at the beginning of June. And so if you'd like to join us for Isaiah part 2, here's the information for ordering the book. I don't have the website here, but it's Precept Ministries International, and I will put their link in the comment section below the video today. And so if you'd like to join us, you could have that book ahead of time. If you don't have access to that book or can't afford that book, you can actually go through this with us anyway, just by following the chapters in Isaiah where we start and then continue. You can see that but part 2 will be starting with chapters 40 and then go through the end. So you will be able to follow along just by using your Bible, which is the great thing about this method of just studying the Bible in depth. And then you'll want to look at cross references, and we'll guide you along by you watching our study. So again, it was exciting for our whole class today to pray for all of you and talk about the fact that we have people watching that we don't know. Again, we'd love to get to know you. If you put a comment down, I'd love to share that with the ladies. And if you have any questions, we'd love to hear those as well. And if this is a study or a website, a channel that's been helpful to you, I don't think of this very often, but it would be great if you would like it or subscribe, and then other people might be more likely to find it. We're just a tiny little channel, which is fine. We're just putting this out there to share our study with other people, and God will do with it what he wants. But if you think about it and you'd like to share it with other people, we'd love to have you do that. Be blessed. And I had Psalm 46 up here, but I don't know if I'll be able to get to it. So just as an extra blessing to line up with our studies, you might want to look up and read Psalm 46 as an encouragement. All right, thanks. And we hope to hear from you soon.